God's primary means of accomplishing His purposes in the world is through the local church. As the local church clearly defines her mission and God-given purposes, she has the privilege of serving as a conduit of God's love. She has the potential to become an invaluable neighbor in the community and a blessing to the whole world. Hi, my name is Don Moore, and I serve as the National Church Ambassador for World Vision Canada. I believe the role of a church-related agency such as World Vision is to come alongside and to assist churches in fulfilling their mission, particularly in areas where special expertise is needed. Much like a general practitioner will call upon a medical specialist to provide their expertise in treating the needs of a patient, so the local church is able to turn to an organization like World Vision with 60 years of experience to assist them as they respond to the needs of those living in poverty and with injustice, both locally and globally. World Vision seeks to serve the church in three primary ways. First, each year, we select one or more ministry specialists to present at our annual Church Leaders Forums, which we host in 12 cities across Canada. During these half-day events, pastors connect with peers while learning from experienced leaders such as Bruxy Cavey, Shane Claiborne, and John Footer. Attendees also receive valuable research materials and ministry resources on the featured topic. Secondly, World Vision publishes resources for church leaders, such as books, DVDs, devotionals, and small group materials to help grow and enrich your ministry. For instance, I'm particularly excited to announce a brand new resource called Sharing God's Heart for the Poor. This 16-session Bible study is ideal for groups or individuals. Comprised of 2 unique 8-session volumes, it contains insightful biblical reflections on the themes of sharing God's heart and being God's hands. You can purchase Sharing God's Heart on World Vision Canada's Church Leader Topics. That's our new online store for busy leaders like you. It features a curated list of 48 of the latest ministry books on themes ranging from vision, strategy, to justice and leadership development. With discounts of up to 30%, you'll want to check back often for regular updates. And thirdly, ministry partnerships provide Canadian churches with the opportunity to be twinned with communities living in poverty in the emerging world. Through global partnership opportunities, your church can help to transform a community of 20 to 25,000 people who are struggling under the weight of poverty. You can help them become self-sufficient and self-sustaining over a period of 8 to 12 years. At the same time, the spiritual life of your congregation will grow as their vision is expanded to embrace the needs of the world. They can develop meaningful relationships with children and their families in your partner community. Here's just a wonderful way to unite your church in mission and to transform a community in need. You see, our goal at World Vision is to come alongside to help you become even more effective in accomplishing your God-given purposes as a church. We're here to serve you as church leaders, so let's keep in touch. Sign up to receive our monthly emails, which provide the latest updates on events, resources, and ideas for your church ministry. Connect with us through Twitter, Facebook, and LinkedIn. Why not check out my weekly blogs on our website and all of the other resources that are available to church leaders. And lastly, we'd love to meet with you. Our church advisors are strategically positioned across Canada, and they'd love to sit down, have a coffee with you, and to learn more about your ministry and ways in which we can work together. As we all come to realize as churches, we can accomplish far more together than if we simply try to go it alone. So let's continue to learn, encourage, and support one another in our common goal to build His kingdom on earth for His honor and for His glory. Hey, great to have you here. Great to have a full house. It's great to be back at the Met. The Met's my, quote, home church from my high school days, which is a few years ago. And I've always appreciated and valued the Met, and particularly, I don't know if Randy's here. Is Randy Jost here? There he is, right there. Randy and I go way back to Briarcrest days, and Randy and his dad, who I grew up under as a pastor here back in, should I say the 60s, 70s? Yeah, and just had a great experience with his dad. And Don's son, Randy, is okay too. Yeah, he's good. Anyways, it's great to be back in the Met and to enjoy this time together today. One of the things that we do each year as we prepare for these forums is, and the biggest challenge to us, is to find the right topic and the right speaker. And the way we do that is through you. Most people have not realized this in the past, but there are evaluation forms on your tables, and don't look at them now, we'll be doing them at the end of the morning. But on there, we ask you to select topics that are high priority to you. And last year, the highest rated priority topics were on vision and strategy. So once we know what the topic is, that the vast majority of pastors, will be over 800 to 1,000 that will attend these forums across Canada. Once we have that topic determined, then we've got to find the right speaker. And we endeavor to find the person who is best suited and can fit into this type of an environment, and particularly speak from a Canadian perspective if at all possible. So we'd like to listen to and learn from you. And then in the fall, before the forums begin in the spring, we do a survey of leaders across the country, and this year we did that again. We surveyed 227 leaders, and if you look in your notebook, don't take time now to do it, but there's about 15 pages of different graphs and information on how leaders in Canada look at vision and strategy when it comes to church ministry. I'd like to take a few minutes just to highlight 5 slides, not all 15, just 5, so you get a bit of the cream of the crop of what that research showed, which I think you'll find it very interesting. First of all, does your church have a vision statement? Well, 99% of the participants agree that vision is important. 86% actually have a vision statement and 14% don't. We realize that the more clearly focused you're on vision in a church, the more likely you can have a rifle effect rather than a shotgun effect in responding to needs in your community and needs in your church. Vision statement is critical. When you look at the next question, who should create the vision statement? That's an interesting response. We had 38% said that pastoral leadership should create it. However, there's a strong sentiment that congregations should be involved. Now, creating a vision statement varies, we discovered, from those in an evangelical tradition versus a mainline tradition. Those in an evangelical tradition tend to lean on a pastoral leadership for vision, whereas mainline churches tend to lean more on the congregation. I would contend and argue that there's a place for both. Whether you begin with the congregation or begin with the pastor, it's got to be owned by both. The broader the base of creation, of creating that vision statement, the more likely that will be adopted and carried on and be owned and actually become a part of the life of your church. What are your church's top priorities for vision and strategy? I found this really interesting as you look at this. Spiritual growth and discipleship was the highest, both with people selecting it overall, 70%, and also with people ranking it as most important, 37%. Secondly, preaching and worship, and then finally, outreach and evangelism and global missions. This is, to me, is significant, because I'm convinced that if we work on the inner development of the people within our congregations, the spiritual life, the discipleship, out of that grows the desire to be a part of the larger community, the worship, the preaching, and out of that, we pray, will come the desire to reach out and to share that which you've been blessed with, deep from deep within, and share that externally. It has been said in marketing terms that often when you go to communicate a message, it will take a consumer up to 7 different messages through different channels before they'll actually, one, not only become aware, but potentially adopt or adapt or take on that change. And so the same thing as churches. It's critical for us to not only have the ownership in creating this statement, but in communicating that it comes through a variety of channels, because our world today is so noisy with so many distractions that are out there. The greatest currency today, we think, is money, but it's actually attention. And everyone out there is trying to get your attention. And as church leaders, we're in that same competition, whether we like to admit it or not, and so we need to work hard in communicating our vision. Finally, does the day-to-day church ministry align with your vision statement? Interesting to see that 72% say that it either moderately or extremely does align. Now, that's really encouraging to me, because the more we are in alignment, the more likely we have a strong impact rather than a diverse, spread out impact. And for those of you who aren't aligned, I think there's lots of room for improvement. In fact, you'll find today, as Mark goes through the whole presentation of vision strategy, you'll find tremendous help on how to bring your ministry into alignment with some of the greatest needs in your community. In case you want some really good ideas, let me just mention this. 2 years ago, some of you, in fact many of you, because I recognize your faces, were here for our forum. And we had myself and Brexy Cabey shared the platform. And during that particular forum, we asked you to submit the names of churches that you felt were really adapting to the new realities in Canada. And out of that we obtained 200 different churches from across Canada, the names. And we had interviewers call them by phone. We took those 40 churches out of the 200, and we published a book called Shifting Stats, Shaking the Church. Very fascinating book. If you haven't gotten a copy, I'd encourage you to get it. I think they're only $10 or something. They're quite reasonable here at the Forum. But the reason I say that is because these are 40 churches that represent virtually every region and province in Canada. They represent congregations from 27 different denominations. They also represent congregations of as small as 30 people to over 3,000. They're topically organized, and at the back, you can sort any story you want by the category you want at the back. So it's got a matrix index at the back. They're only 6-page stories, but they are so creative and they're so ingenious in many ways of people who have just gone beyond their borders to look at, hey, you know what, over the last 20 years, our immediate community, well, of course, it's changed for the Met because they moved here, in 2008, but downtown, that has changed so significantly. How do we adapt our ministry to meet those needs? So I'd encourage you to take a look at that book. I think you'll find that fascinating and a great source for vision. So that's all I'm going to say about the research, but I thought that would be a bit of a teaser. You're welcome to look through the rest in your book as you have time, and I think you'll enjoy that. Now I'm pleased to present to you Mark Buchanan. Mark has just done a phenomenal job in the last 8 cities across Canada. We've done all of Western Canada, and now we're in Ottawa, Montreal tomorrow, St. John's on Thursday, and Friday in Halifax, and that will conclude the tour this year. Mark, as you see from on the screen above you, has pastored for many years, 6 years in Vernon, BC, 18 years in Duncan on Vancouver Island. He's written many books. You'll see a number of the books up there, but he's also written The Rest of God, Hidden in Plain Sight, and Your Church is Too Safe. He's currently working on a couple of novels, but one particular one on the life of David. If I may suggest this, the book that I like the best of Mark's, I guess it's right here, is Spiritual Rhythm. He gave me a copy about 2 years ago when we first started talking about doing these forums. I took it home, put it on a nightstand, and it disappeared. My wife read it, and she came and said, Don, this is dynamite. You should read this. That's why I had meant to read it, but you got to it before me. So if you want something for your wife, get this. No, I mean, get this for yourself. He actually goes through the seasons of your ministry, life cycle, the ups and downs, and how do you deal with that? How do you reckon with the realities of what you face in ministry? From a guy who's been in it for 24 years, of course he's a prof as well, but still, the reality is this is a terrific book. Who was I talking to? Lyle Johnson, good old Met boy from my teenage years. Lyle's just reading this and was just saying it's outstanding, and that's partly why he's here this morning, because of that book. So I'd encourage you to look at that. Mark has a few descriptors of himself. It's always nice when the speaker writes his own bio, because then you get to read it. Mark says he's a writer, a professor, a fisherman, a scuba diver. He loves rich, dark coffee, lowrider motorcycles. He's a teacher, a father, an author, a husband, a neighbor, a friend. Mark's a worshiper in the spirit of truth, a man after God's own heart, and a chief of sinners. He lives in Calgary with his wife Cheryl, and they have 3 grown kids. Let's give him a warm Ottawa welcome.
So good to be. I love this city. I've spent very little time here, but it's so beautiful. Very, very happy to be back, and very glad to be working with my friends at World Vision. What I love about the ministry of World Vision is it's really got 3 key emphases. The gospel of Jesus Christ. They believe in the power of the gospel, just as Paul does in Romans. It is this power that makes life new. And they believe that for themselves. They live in that place of hungering after the righteousness of God, and believe it for individuals. They also believe in the kingdom of God, that when the gospel comes into a life, it has not only a personal transformational effect, but it begins to transform the world around you. And I've seen that up close, especially in a trip I had with Dawn and a few others a couple of years ago to Brazil, and saw firsthand the transformation of community. And then the third is they believe in the local church. And quite honestly, if that third emphasis wasn't there, I'd be somewhat reluctant to partner with them, because I pastored for 24 years. And I think God's plan A is a church, and Plan B is a church, and Plan C is a church. So I'm just very honored, Don and company, to be representing World Vision and partnering with you at these events. And this is for the local church. I would consider success today if I have at least a dozen quotable tweets. Not so. How I would measure success today is first if the conversation that you will get in several times around the table was lively and vigorous and meaty. That I'm here to broker that conversation. That with people maybe you came with or people you just met, that you would dig into the themes and topics we're going to be going over in more than a cursory way. It would matter to you. Secondly, I'm going to measure success, and this one I don't think I'll be able to follow up with, but whether or not there is a conversation after you leave today. In your own head and heart, conversation with your leaders, conversation maybe among churches, because what I want to talk to you about today is vision, strategy, and the mission of the church. And I'm not coming with a bag full of answers. I'm actually wanting to stir up some thinking about this. In some ways, it'll just be a confirmation, reminder. In other ways, I may say some things that in a way that you haven't thought or heard before. And I hope that provokes a deep reflection, prayerfulness, and conversation in the days, weeks, and months to follow. I know all of you here are not pastors, but most pastors can attest to an experience, something akin to this, where you've had to navigate the gap between the vision you cast and its implementation. And so it usually goes something like this. There's this, some of you, this might have been a long time ago if you're a pastor, some of you quite recently, but the church got interested in you, you got interested in the church. It came down to date night, candidating. You know that word date and candidating? There's some truth in that, isn't there? Where you come and you kind of put on your best behavior and they put on their best dress and you go to a swank restaurant, so to speak. Everybody's, behaving themselves. And if they ask you to preach, you get up and you pull out a chestnut. I mean, the thing that it's just been a zinger every time you've preached this, the kingdom has come in power. And you nail that. But somewhere in that dating process, you say something to the effect, if you were to call me as your pastor, you need to know that this is my vision or this is what I want to see happen. I would love to see change over here. I'd love to see us reach this group of people. And pretty much with full universal acclaim, they said, yes, that's why we want you. That's why we're calling you. We want you to bring that kind of dramatic change. We need it. And you maybe even tested that. You said, no, you have to understand, things are gonna change here if I come. And they said, that's why we want you. That's why it's you. So you came and it all went swimmingly until Elbowgate or something. I mean, it just all really went well. And then maybe 4, 5, 6 months into it, you actually put into motion some of the vision that you're talking about. And that set off alarm bells with a whole bunch of people, and they got their backs up and they dug their heels in. And when you said, well, but remember we talked about this 6 months ago? And they say, yeah, but we didn't mean this. I wonder if the Apostle Peter had a moment like that. I want you to reimagine that moment when he gets up in the book of Acts chapter 2, and the Spirit has fallen upon the faith community, and they're speaking in the tongues of all those gathered around, the known languages, but they themselves probably don't speak those languages, but the Spirit has empowered them, or maybe empowered those there to hear whatever they're saying in their own mother tongue. And people are awestruck, but some are mocking, and they say, you're drunk. So Peter gets up, and he says, no, this isn't drunkenness. It's only 9 a.m. This is that thing Joel was talking about, Joel 2, verse 28 and following, where the Spirit in the last days is going to be poured out upon all flesh, male, female, young, old, rich and poor. And the young men will dream dreams, and the old men will see visions. And he goes on a bit more with the prophecy of Joel, and then kicks into high gear about the revelation of Jesus. I wonder if again, you could sort of rethink or reconceive that whole speech as almost his candidating speech. That he gets up there and he says, I am announcing to you that a new day has arrived. It's a day of the Spirit, and in that new day, young men, old men, women, girls, whatever, there's going to be visions and dreams. And the people said, yes, we've been waiting for this. There's been a famine of the Word of God. There's not many visions in those days. I'm quoting from 1 Samuel 3. Yes. And so this thing launches with great hurrah, and we read about the early chapters of Acts. Everybody's excited. But I wonder if it really starts to get implemented in earnest a little later on, when the gospel's now moving out to a different community, the Gentile community. And they find out, the church in Jerusalem, that this is going to be at the cost not of the Gentiles, but of the Jewish community. That there's going to have to be some adjustments in the church that's bringing the gospel, not the church or the people that are receiving it. And it's particularly around the whole idea of what kind of food we eat. And if you remember in chapter 10 of Acts, Peter is up on the rooftop one day, and he's been fasting, and he's probably got low blood sugars. And he walks up on the rooftop, and somebody is doing barbecue. There's savory aromas. You know, it's got some Louisiana hot sauce in that thing, and it's just kind of wafting over and he just goes, ugh. And it says he falls into a trance. It actually says this in Acts 10. And then this vision, thrice repeated, of this blanket coming down, and frolicking, cavorting about in the blanket are all the animals he ain't supposed to eat. It's kind of like gumbo or something. It's got some ham in there and some shrimp in there and all this stuff he's not supposed to eat. And this command from heaven, get up, kill, eat that stuff. And he's like, no. But finally he's convinced it is. And right when he's finished having this vision, there's a knock on the door. And it's from a man, servants from a man named Cornelius, a Gentile who's very warm toward the Jewish religion, and he's had a vision. So there'll be dreams and visions, 2 visions coming together. And Peter tags along, and he goes into the house of Cornelius, sits down and eats, and then the Holy Spirit falls after a conversation. And Peter very explicitly says, if God had not shown me in a vision that I could cross the threshold, and it would be not on my terms, but on yours. I'm the one who has to forsake something in terms of long-held, in fact, 2,000 years of practice. I have to abandon that in order to actually bring the gospel into your home. So this is it. So now we're seeing the implementation of this dreams and visions stuff. We're seeing concretely what it looks like. I mean, there's one thing to preach a sermon, Rhonda, and you say, I have a dream. And they go, yeah. And then at some point, it gets messy. It gets costly. It gets disruptive. And people say, well, but we just wanted the dream to remain in the abstract. We didn't mean this. And so what happens when this happens is the word gets back to the stakeholders, the gatekeepers, the old guard, the people who built this church, and they ain't too happy. It says in chapter 11 of Acts, when Peter went up to Jerusalem, the circumcised believers, the old guard, criticized him and said, "You went into the house of uncircumcised men and ate with them." Now, listen very carefully. The vision is being implemented. This group of believers who've been around for a long time aren't very happy about it, and so they sharply criticize him. They bring objection, and what I want you to notice is how Peter defends himself, because if ever you're in the position that I'm just describing, where some people are really angry about the concrete, specific ways you're applying the vision, you just have to say what Peter did, okay? Verse 5, I was in the city of Joppa praying, and in a trance I saw a vision. That's all you need to say. He explains it a little bit more. And then their response will be exactly what it was in Peter's case, verse 18 of chapter 11. When they heard this, they had no further objections and praised God. So thank you so much, Ottawa. It's been great. Honestly, if you said to the leaders or the people, stakeholders in your church, the reason we're overturning 2,000 years of tradition, or maybe even 20 years of tradition in this place, the reason we're adjusting for the sake of the community to reach them is, in a trance I had a vision. You're getting pink slipped that day. It doesn't sort of end the debate, end the objections. It actually fires them up in a fresh way. That's what you got? That's all you got? I tell that story because I want you to note something. The deep, deep regard the early church had for vision. And we're not talking vision where they sat around a boardroom table and, sort of all talked about what they thought they should do. We're talking about weird stuff that the Holy Spirit alone can do. And the church had such a profound regard for this vision that once Peter says, but it was a vision God gave me, and I was in a trance, but that is a slam dunk. That is a clincher for the early church. In fact, when I used to read Peter's sermon in Acts 2, and he quotes from Joel, and he says, in the last days, Spirit poured out, young men will dream dreams, old men will see visions. I used to think it was just a very highly poetic way of saying people will be creative when the Spirit comes. But then I started to notice how often this word vision occurs in the book of Acts. After that mention of the dreams and visions, there's 12 references to vision. To sum it up, vision is the operative way God opens up mission to new people groups. When he's about to do a fresh thing, in almost every instance, he gives a weird vision And by the way, he often gives us another Pentecost to go with it, another pouring out of the Spirit. There's 3 Pentecosts narrated in the book of Acts. The Pentecost that we're all familiar with, Acts 2, but that's the Jerusalem, Judea. It's a Jewish diaspora. There's a Pentecost and outpouring of the Spirit in Acts chapter 8 with the coming of the gospel to Samaria. And then there's a 3rd Pentecost narrated in the story of Cornelius with the pouring out of the Spirit for the reaching of the ends of the earth, the Gentiles. Implying that when God's going to move your church into new terrain, he's probably going to give somebody a vision. And then as you step into it, he's going to give you fresh empowering by the Spirit. Dreams and visions. It was so taken seriously. In fact, at the very end of Paul's life, the last occurrence of this word vision is in Acts 26:19, where the Apostle Paul is talking to one of the Herods, King Agrippa. Festus, a pagan who can't make head or tail of what Paul's saying, calls in this Jewish king, and Paul seizes the opportunity to try to actually convince him of the gospel. And Paul simply says to King Agrippa, as he describes what he's seen of Jesus in this early vision when he's knocked to the ground, he just says to King Agrippa, I was not disobedient to the vision from heaven. So talking to a non-Christian king in the presence of a pagan leader, Festus, Paul says, this is a vision-driven ministry I'm about. And nobody says, oh, that's weird. They expect it. I grew up in the era of the visionary leader. It's always been visionary leaders, but I grew up in the era, when the visionary leader was like the rock star, the sports star, royalty, Steve Jobs, Martin Luther King Jr., Elon Musk. These are people that if in their lifetime you had met them, or Elon now, they kind of have this rock star aura about them. Probably the iconic visionary of the last century, whose legacy lives on in our own day, is Walt Disney. A couple stories about Walt. In 1966, December, he fell in his home. He actually fell down. They thought it was exhaustion, but it turned out to be stage 4 cancer, lung cancer. He was a chain smoker who always tried to hide that from the public. And it was inoperable, untreatable stage 4 lung cancer. And he never saw that Christmas of 1966, and he never got out of the hospital. His health deteriorated very, very rapidly in about 3 weeks from the falling down to his death. And in those 3 weeks, there was a journalist who wanted to try to get in and have one last interview with him. The family had set up all kinds of barriers because they didn't want Walt disturbed, but this journalist was incredibly persistent and finally got past all the obstacles and got into the room with Walt. And it turned out Walt was very, very eager to actually have this one last interview. But his voice had reduced to a whisper. He was so weak. So he invited the journalist to actually come up and lie on the bed with him. Well, he whispered to this man his latest dream. His latest dream was Disney World, to be built in Orlando. The ground hadn't been broken, but he looked up at the white ceiling, and in this very thin whisper, he described in intimate, intricate detail every part of Disney World, such that the journalist wrote it all down and pretty much had a blueprint by the time they were done. 6 years later, 1972, Disney World opened. Big hurrah, big celebration. Mike Vance, the Dean of Creativity in the Disney Empire, was standing there, and someone, different versions of who that someone was, but somebody turned to Mike Vance and said, "Isn't it a shame that Walt never lived to see this?" To which Mike Vance responded, "But Walt did see this, that's why it's here." Now, I am very moved by those kind of stories. However, I've never, ever mistaken Disney World for the kingdom of God. I never stood in the midst of all the spectacle and splendor and, hurrah, and said, "Oh my goodness, the kingdom has come." It's a wonderful thing and all that, but so here's the question. How do we know this is God speaking? How do we distinguish divine revelation, Holy Spirit imparted vision, from just our own best thinking, our own best creativity, or sometimes our own delusion? Actually, it's a sobering thing to think that one of the most visionary leaders of the 20th century was Adolf Hitler. How do we distinguish between our own thinking that might be driven by delusion, hubris, wishfulness, and actually God saying, "This is me"? Some touchstones for discerning God's vision. And these are touchstones. It's non-exhaustive. It's non-prescriptive. These are simple patterns that I have observed in Scripture as the community wrestles with, is this God or is this just my own head? Number one, it's often surprising. Didn't see it coming. Bit of a head scratcher. This is just my own inner desire being projected outward. It's got a surprising read. It can be subversive, it can be disruptive, it's usually costly. You don't see it coming and often didn't wish for it to come. So a good example would be what I just talked about with Peter having this vision that undoes or overthrows 2,000 years of sacred food laws, deeply cherished by the community that has been part of, defining who they are. And in this threefold vision, has to be repeated, and I'll come to that in a moment, it gets completely eradicated. It's a surprise. He did not see that coming. Another example would be that God would choose the Apostle Paul, the original ISIS or ISIL member, as his premier evangelist and church planter. The early church, it took a long time for them to get their head around that one. They held him like this. Because they weren't, I'm sure they sent up a few prayers, but they were probably imprecatory. They were probably like, "Break that guy's teeth, God." They were probably praying, those kind of psalms for Paul. And when he did finally come to faith, there was the heightened suspicion and lingering animosity that the early church had toward the Apostle Paul. It took them a long time, and Barnabas really to kind of pave the way before they could embrace him. Nobody quite had that on their radar. It was a surprise. And vision, it was all about vision, vision from heaven, as he himself describes it. So surprising. Number two, persistent. There tends to be a repetitiveness about it. Again, pointing to the vision in Acts 10, the threefold repetition of the blanket with the frolicking animals. Get up, kill, eat. No, Lord. It nags you. It bothers you. It doesn't go away. It's not easily dismissed. It's not easily explained away. Now, let me pause briefly at that moment and say this. some of you, I would border on saying all of you, have had some weird vision that maybe you've done nothing with because it was too strange, too costly, too disruptive, too hard to explain to others. And when you first had it, you maybe chalked it up to the low blood sugars or the enchiladas you had last night. But it hasn't gone away. It just hasn't gone away. I want you to pay attention to it. Number 3, so surprising, persistent, it can come from anyone. In the last days, I will pour out my Spirit on all flesh, on the young and the old, and men and women, on visions for young men, dreams for old men. It can come from anybody. I think it needs a process of discernment among some key leaders. So I think the way we discern the vision once it comes forth is very important in terms of testing this. Is this really, do we believe this is from God? What do we think is being asked of us? Because vision often is a summons, it's not a blueprint. So it's not, here's the 5 steps you take. It's the man in Macedonia saying, get over here, we need you. It's a summons. It doesn't give you the specifics. So it needs to be discerned. But let me give you a quick example of this can come from anybody. When I was pastoring on Vancouver Island, we had one of, at that point, I'm not sure what the statistics are now, but it was the highest incident of low-income single-family homes in per capita in Canada. Lots of single parents and particularly single moms. Low income, drawing welfare, hand to mouth, trying to get through. And we never had a vision for that. In fact, to be honest, it wasn't entirely on my radar. But this young woman in our church suddenly and tragically found herself a single mom. And she had 2 kids on her hand, and she had a job. Her husband had been mostly working, mostly drawing the salary. Her job was part-time. And she had grown up in an upper middle class home, and her 2 favorite times of the year growing up were back to school and Christmas. And what she found flipped for her, becoming a single parent, is those 2 times of the year immediately became her most dreaded. You have to provide all sorts of things for your little guys. I mean, just from haircuts to new shoes to backpacks for back to school, etc. All the supplies. And then, of course, Christmas, that's obvious. And she came and she had a vision. And the vision was a very practical way to come alongside single parents at back to school and Christmas. Now, a very quick description. We ended up calling this ministry Jumpstart. We stole it from Canadian Tire, and then we actually realized it's probably a copyright issue. So we went to Canadian Tire. We asked if we could use it. They said yes, and then they became one of the main corporate contributors to this ministry. So yay to them. And what we did is, I'll just describe the back to school one. And by the time I left that church, this was being used by about 700 people in a small community. Is they'd come in and they'd drive, they had a car, we'd have out in the parking lot, and we collaborated with other churches in the entire community. So you could be a total pagan and help out with this. But we had maybe 30, 40 mechanics out in the parking lot who were taking your car, diagnosing it, and then we had a deal going on with one of the big auto suppliers, and they would do like a 48-point check or whatever, change the oil, change all the filters out, make sure the tires were okay. Sometimes we'd actually swap out the tires if they're bad, etc. They're doing all that, and then they're taking that vehicle over to the youth group who's detailing it, and then parking it at the curb when the mom comes out, the car's all ready. Meanwhile, mom and children go in. They go into this huge room where clothes, many of them new, but if they're donated, they have to be good and they have to be clean. You know, if it's junk, throw it out. If it's nice clothes, you can bring them. And it was beautiful. And they could get as many clothes as they needed or wanted for themselves and their children. Shoes, everything. Bags of them. They'd come over. They'd go from there, and we had maybe 20 hairstylists in various parts, and you could just pick from a magazine, I want this haircut, my son wants this haircut, and they would do a shampoo and cut your hair, style your hair. These are professional hairstylists. And then often the moms would go and they could have a pedicure, manicure, all those sorts of things. And then go and be waited upon for lunch, beautiful gourmet lunch. We had a chef making that for them. And then on their way out to go get their car at the curb, they would go into a room and a brand new backpack, brand new, never been used before, and really good stuff, roots and stuff. We had a number of corporate sponsors for this. They'd get a brand new backpack that was age sensitive and gender sensitive, filled with the school supplies they needed, because we worked with the schools. We found out what school supplies they needed for that year, and they were in the backpack plus a week of healthy snacks. And that's what they walked out with all of their bags. And this came from a young woman in her 20s who found herself suddenly single. And it was one of the most significant ministries, and then the Christmas one had a similar dynamic. It can come from anybody. It's discerned by maybe a smaller group, but it can come from anybody. Number 4, it calls us to live in a dependence on and an expectancy of the Holy Spirit. And let me just use this to make my one point that I will about strategy. As I said a moment ago, divine vision is a summons, not a blueprint. It functions as a kind of this impression, sometimes with a very visual content to it. You need to go there. You need to be involved here. It's a summons. The strategy then gets worked out in a number of ways, but one of them is a readiness and an attentiveness as you go to listen and depend on God. Illustrate this through the story in Acts 16 where Paul is trying to get into Bithynia, Asia Minor. Somehow the Holy Spirit's saying no, so he ends up going to sleep, has a dream of the man in Macedonia. Get over here. Wakes up and concludes where to get over there. That's all they get, just to get over here. By the way, just a little a speculation about that story, the get over here. Was that man in the dream simply an everyman? Was he some kind of symbolic man crying? Or was he an actual man? And we don't know. But it's interesting when they end up going up into Macedonia, into the city of Philippi, that there's one man who gets very dramatically saved, who's treated Paul and his companion Silas with real harshness and brutality, but somehow is so overcome by these men's response to that hostility by singing and praying, and their kindness toward him in other ways, that he asks them, he falls on his knees before them and says, how do I get in on this? It's a Philippian jailer. So just, it's a sheer speculation, but I think there's some hints that maybe the man in the dream is that man. Get over here. So there's a summons. Now when you look at the story of going to Macedonia, going to Philippi, what you see is a team of evangelists who are every moment attentive to how the Spirit might be functioning in this particular situation. Go down to the river, they meet Lydia, they go down to the river again, they meet the slave girl with a demon, they cast her out. They're sensitive to the Roman jailer. What we see is that when we've received the vision, it's not like, okay, God, thanks, we've got it, we'll carry it out. But you're kind of tingling with a sense of anticipation that everywhere you go, God's going to open up your eyes and show you new things. I think it's the 6th point. It calls us to speak. 5th, right? Okay. It calls us to speak of God and his wonders in fresh ways. Acts 2 again, where the Spirit falls and suddenly they can speak the wonders of God in ways that people who are round about can understand. Now, it's interesting that in that moment of the Spirit falling in Acts 2, the diaspora, the Jewish community gathered in Jerusalem for the feast of Pentecost, it's not that they don't speak Aramaic or Greek. It's just that when the believers who are empowered with the Spirit open their mouth, it's heard by those around in their mother tongue. The church that we're involved in Vancouver Island, and my closing remarks today will be aimed at this, but we had a significant ministry among First Peoples in our town. And I never met any Cowichan person who didn't speak very good English, understood it, spoke it well. But the first time in our church that we had somebody sing "How Great Thou Art" in Hulkaminam, which is the language of the Coast Salish people, you could feel something break in the heavens. And the Cowichan people sat and wept to hear the wonders of God in their own tongue. And some of them didn't even speak their own tongue that well. They just knew their own tongue. This is what my grandma spoke. And now I'm hearing "How great thou art" in that voice, in those cadences that my grandma used to speak over me. So it empowers us to speak the wonders of God in fresh ways. We'll start to communicate the gospel in ways that those around us say, "I get that." It's not Christianese. Number 6, it calls us to lose our religion. It's striking to me as you go through the book of Acts how often we have something similar to what I just narrated with Peter in Acts 10 and then Acts 11, having to surrender, relinquish some of his own religious practices for the sake of reaching the people he's trying to get to. This is actually a repeat theme throughout the book of Acts. Finally, it's official in the book of, in chapter 15, where the Jerusalem council gathers and saying, okay, if we're going to reach these Gentiles, we've got to resolve this issue on whose terms? And it turns out it's mostly on the Gentiles' terms. Paul finally will say this in 1 Corinthians chapter 9, "To the Jew I became a Jew in order to reach as many as possible, to the Gentile, a Gentile, to this, etc. I didn't become them, but I would bend as far as I could into their world in order to make the gospel credible and appealing to them." This is huge implications that I'll hopefully draw out a bit later. Lastly, it calls us to stop seeing anyone with old eyes. This is from 2 Corinthians chapter 5, where the Apostle Paul is talking about the message and the ministry of reconciliation that that God himself has given this man, called him into God's own ministry, reconciliation, be reconciled, and appointed him as ambassador. And Paul says the foundation of actually being actively, vigorously, effectively involved in calling people everywhere. Because as he says, "I am convinced Christ died for all and therefore all can live." Are you convinced of that? And then he actually says, and God is not counting sins against anybody. How are we doing on that? We see somebody far from God, do we count their sins against them? Or does it just deepen, as it did for the Apostle Paul, his anguish and his yearning to see them know Christ? And he says the foundation of us actually being effective ministers and messengers of God's gospel of reconciliation is this: we no longer look at anyone from a worldly point of view. Anyone. I think Paul is actually giving his own autobiography at that point. Because he says, for we used to look at Christ this way. Remember how Paul looked at Jesus? Before Jesus knocked him down and actually knocked him blind in order to do some ophthalmological rearrangements in the boy. Because he sees very narrowly. And then Jesus comes and makes it all go out for a while, so that when the scales fall, it's this. And I no longer look at anybody according to old ways of seeing them, but I look at everybody as somebody Jesus died for and loves and doesn't count their sin against them. And I'm sending you to tell them that I am like this. When we get God's vision, it's always going to rearrange our eyesight a bit and open it wider, that we would not look at anybody from a worldly point of view. There's some questions. They're going to come up on the screen. You've got 12 minutes to get around your table and dig in. As mentioned, I pastored for many years in just 2 churches, 6 and a bit years in a church in the Okanagan Valley, 18 years in a church on Vancouver Island. It's been 2 very hardship calls, as you can see. That was a joke, but maybe probably about 10 years into ministry, I realized that there was a flaw in my character that was wreaking havoc in my ability to lead well. I wanted to please people. And I had subtly but distinctly developed a ministry of what I would call placation or appeasement. I wanted to get to bed by 9:30. And I had, over the time, out of this desire to please people, had ended up with no malice aforethought in a habit of compromise. And so I won't go into all the details how the Lord got my attention. But as I began to realize that I needed personally to be on the mission of God, with God, for the glory of God, by the power of God, to do the things that Jesus himself would do, were he in our community, and he was. And I need to join him in that. But I realized that there is a very simple way to measure our health on that score, whether we were really doing the work and the ministry and the power of Jesus that he would have us do, or whether we were just doing our own thing. It's very easy. It's a simple diagnostic. You can apply it in about 20 seconds, if not less time. It has 2 parts to it. Were we, as we did what we're doing, annoying, or rather attracting the same people Jesus attracted? Because I was stunned as I started to go through the Gospels again, and I would watch, sometimes, Jesus would come into a situation, and Mark 9's a good example. He's been up the mountain with Peter, John, and James. They've seen him in his coming glory and splendor, the transfiguration. They come down, and it says, when they came to the bottom of the mountain, there was an argument going on between the disciples and the teachers of the law. That sounded like church. And the arguments around this boy with a demon and the father pleading with the disciples, can you cast it out? And they're hopeless, useless, ineffective, impotent, as are the teachers of the law. And yet when Jesus shows up on that scene, and you get the sense that there's kind of a gloating on the part, if not, a boredom/gloating on the part of the demon who's afflicting this poor boy and bringing such anguish to the father. And there's a kind of mass boredom in the crowd as they watch this argument go on between the disciples and the teachers of the law. Jesus shows up, and this is typical of whenever Jesus shows up, is a crowd starts running to him. Always the crowds running to him. The crowds being amazed at his teaching, because this is with authority, not like the teachers of the law. It reaches a place where the number one criticism of Jesus is, the number one criticism, he's a Sabbath breaker. The second criticism is he eats with sinners. It means he likes them, he hangs out with them. Are we attracting the same people Jesus attracted? Are the kind of people that maybe would be bored with just a religious person come running, even if it's somewhat, they're not, it's not their normal world to be hanging out in the church. But would they come running? Are we attracting the same people Jesus attracted? Second, and I almost gave it away, are we annoying the same people Jesus annoyed? I was speaking last week at the Christian and Missionary Alliance National Assembly. Happened to be held in my town in Calgary. And I had chosen to speak on the upper room discourse, John 14, 15, 16, and then the prayer in 17 context in John 13. And as I was preparing those messages, I had one of those astonishing discoveries that we get time to time. And that is in John's Gospel, chapter 15 and 16, Jesus says, the world will hate you. And for years and years, I'd read that as the pagan world will hate you. Now, John eventually, as he nuances that whole concept of the world, will come to the whole world, the cosmos, the reigning ideology, the prevailing spirit of the age. He'll get finally to this principalities and powers kind of definition of the world. But the stunning revelation was in John 15 and 16, when Jesus refers to the world, and you can go exegete this in light of this if you haven't already had this revelation or discovery. Jesus is not talking about the pagan world, he's talking about the religious world. Because the people who have been persecuting him, hating him, opposed to him, have actually not been the pagan world. A few little encounters he's had with the Greeks, one happens in John 12, they're just like in awe. The people who are sort of the nominal religious people, the man at the pool of Bethsaida, the man born blind, they're pretty dazzled. What we have is a mounting narrative from John chapter 7 to John chapter 12 of the religious world getting increasingly vexed to the point of murderousness with Jesus. And I realize that it's built into the very narrative of Jesus Christ, and therefore into the narrative of the one who says in John 20:21, as the Father has sent me, so I'm sending you. Receive the Holy Spirit. It's built into the very nature of that ministry that it's going to annoy some people big time. And the first group of people that we see Jesus annoying are the religious people. And so as the Lord began to give me back some years ago about this attracting and annoying thing, and let me emphasize, I'm not talking about being obnoxious. And I'm not talking in the attraction of just being hip and cool, or even a little bit being hip and cool. I'm talking about when we're doing the ministry and the anointing and power of Jesus according to the vision that he's given, that is by its very nature going to have this dynamic about it. Attractive to the kind of people that were attracted to him, annoying to the kind of people that were annoyed by him. It's just going to have this. And indeed, as we moved out more and more in what we believed was the vision that God had given us and the power we believed he'd poured out, we indeed found that very thing going on. Well, what I want to do in this next section is look at not so much that, but that Jesus is so himself attentive to what the Father shows him he should do, that it takes him to extraordinary lengths. Jesus in John 5, I think it's 19, says, you want to know my MO? You want to know how I'm doing ministry, how I'm living life? I just watch to see what the Father's doing, then I go do it. And in John 14, he says, and the words you hear me saying are actually the words of the Father. They're not my own. And so there's a sense of Jesus deeply attentive to what the Father was about, what the Father was doing, and he simply came alongside of that. So in that light, this story that I'm about to read, which I think is a quintessential I dare you story, that really captures how far the Father is willing to go in his mission to a broken world. And as a Father sent me, Jesus says, I'm sending you. It's Mark's Gospel, or this is the version I'm going to read, verse 35, chapter 4, Mark 4, 35 and following. That day when evening came, Jesus said to his disciples, let us go over to the other side. Leaving the crowd behind, they took him along just as he was in the boat. There were also other boats with him. A furious squall came up, and the waves broke over the boat so that it was nearly swamped. Jesus was in the stern, sleeping on a cushion. The disciples woke him and said to him, Teacher, don't you care if we drown? He got up, rebuked the wind, and said to the waves, Quiet, be still. Then the wind died down, and it was completely calm. He said to his disciples, Why are you so afraid? Do you still have no faith? They were terrified and asked each other, Who is this? Even the wind and the waves obey him. Let's go over to the other side. Maybe you're here today simply to hear that. Jesus say to you, let's go over to the other side. Let's go further than we've gone. If you look at what's preceded that invitation and challenge that he puts out to his disciples, it's not that they've been lying, resting on their laurels. They've been involved in a pretty heady round of ministry activity involving confrontation with religious powers, confrontation with the evil spirits, Jesus' own mother and brother thinking he's needs to be committed, etc. There's a lot going on. Jesus doing healings. So they've been caught up in the ministry of Jesus already. And then Jesus turns and says, there's more. Let's go further. I'm not talking about a ethos or a culture of drivenness. We don't need more of that. Of restlessness. Of novelty hounding. But what that simple invitation reveals is that Jesus is always looking for those who've yet to be included in the kingdom of God. Let's go over to the other side. And you know what the other side is, what's on the other side here. I mean, at this point, maybe the boys are thinking, oh man, it's been tough and we're doing our little mini sabbatical or something. We're going to go and have a little holiday. And, but they know the other side is Syria, literally. And so they must have maybe a sinking feeling that Jesus doesn't have in mind a little sort of cottage by the seaside. He's got something big he's cooking up here. The other side is Legion. This man that has been banished, cast out from his own community. We find out that Jesus later sends him back to those, his family, to tell them all the things that God has done. And he takes it beyond that and goes to 10 cities because he's a flaming evangelist. But the community at this point doesn't want him around. And so they've banished him, exiled him to the tombs, and they've chained him up, but he's so strong he breaks the chains. He runs around naked, howling, cutting himself, bruising himself. That's who they're going to, one guy that nobody wants. How far does the mission of God stretch? I think this story is, obviously an historical story. It's also a paradigmatic story. It's a template story. It's telling us that there really is no limit to God's heart of compassion. That when Paul talks about the ministry of reconciliation and he says we look at no one from a worldly point of view, he's getting the heart of Jesus. Because no one looks at Legion as somebody to whom you can make the appeal, be reconciled to God, except Jesus alone. Let's go to the other side. Let's go there. So they go, and it says that the disciples, and whether they're grumpy about it, we know in that story where Jesus wants to go back fishing after they've been up it all night, that we get a sense that, they're none too happy about that. But we don't know if they're grumpy about this or not. But what we do know is they take charge. It actually says, so they took him along, Jesus along, just as he was. The Greek means they took charge of him. And then Jesus promptly goes and falls asleep. And I have a feeling that this may have been suggested by the fishermen. The reason I know this or think this is because my wife's uncle and her nephews are all professional fishermen off the west coast of Vancouver. And a few times I've been out on the sea with those guys when a big squalls come up. And even though I don't consider myself a landlubber, I've been on I've got pretty good sea legs. But when I ask them, what can I do in this perilous moment? It's always, can you go over there and sit down? They do not want me underfoot. There's nothing I can do. And the only thing they're concerned about is that I'll, fall over and drown. So Jesus the carpenter says, let's go to the other side. And they're the experts, right? They're the fishermen. Since before they had acquired language, Peter, James, and John knew how to handle that boat. They'd been out with their dad. They knew, they'd seen it all. And so, of course, they're going to take charge. If Jesus steps into your world, you take charge of him. You take him along. He hangs out with you. And I'm wondering, even as I say, if Peter sort of said, hey, Jesus, why don't you, hey, there's some cushions. Hey, look at cushions in the boat. Why don't you curl up there? Maybe even went over in his rough, hoary fisherman voice, kind of lullabied him. Rock-a-bye, baby. Just tried to get him into that dreamland, and Jesus falls asleep. Storm comes up, and suddenly the familiar becomes unfamiliar, and the known, unknown, and the safe, dangerous. And the world that they had mastered, they're frightened little children in. Has this ever happened to you? A world that you knew, you had mastery of. I've talked to so many pastors, for instance, but it could be your family situation, health situation, marriage, friendship, But just let me reference so many pastors I've talked to actually on this trip, as I've drawn out this point, who said, I've been at this church for 12 years, and I thought I knew every inch of it. I thought I knew what was going on. I felt kind of in charge. And then this last couple months, this has happened. And I have no idea where I am or what to do. And this world that they were so competent in, they're suddenly scrambling. And so they wake Jesus up. They wake the carpenter up. And a bunch of questions start to come, two from the disciples, two from Jesus. Their two are, do you not care if we drown? And if you've been where the familiar has become unfamiliar and the known has become strange and the safe has become dangerous, you've surely asked that question. How could you let this happen? When we launched into our walking alongside the First Peoples, because when I talk about a ministry, it sounds like something we were doing for people. The First Nations people did more for me than I ever did for them. And so it was a profound friendship and relationship, and a time of, and continues to be a time of profound learning for me. But when we launched into that, very much sensing that this was the heart of God, the vision of Jesus for our church, I thought it was going to be, up and to the right in terms. It was a mess, and so many people left, and so much the giving dropped dramatically, and people were upset about a lot of stuff. Not just that, but I think that was the root of it, and they masked their anger around other issues, etc. And there was a few moments, more than a few, where in that storm I said, Jesus, do you not care if we drown? This was not my idea. This was yours to go to the other side. And they also asked this question, who is this? Well, you think if you've kind of thrown your lot in with him and you've kind of left home and family and whatnot to tag along. I mean, James and John and, the sons of Zebedee and Peter and Andrew, they've kind of packed up to go follow him. You think they would have that one pretty much in hand. Who is this? But they're confused, puzzled. And Jesus has two questions for them. Why are you so afraid? Well, I'm going to die. It'd be one. Yeah, whatever. And then this other one, and I think this one is galling. Do you still have no faith? Hello? I heard you say, come follow me. I left everything and followed you. I left my fishnets way back there and followed you. And you're asking, do I still have no faith? Well, it turns out trips to the other side tend to provoke these kind of questions. Do you not care? Who are you? And he's saying, what are you afraid of? Why are you afraid? And then the insulting one, do you still have no faith? I'm going to draw these out as touchstones in a moment, but I was preaching on the Legion text back in December in the city of Kelowna. I'd been invited by my friend's teen challenge to speak at a banquet to thank people who had given money to the ministry. And I decided I would take this text about Legion, actually, and talk about the ministry of Teen Challenge, because Teen Challenge works with both men and women, and you don't have to be a teenager, it turns out, who have got caught up in some lifestyle of profound addiction where they need an intervention. And I've watched the the lives of many men and women be transformed by this ministry that bears with, comes along, goes and finds. And so I thought, well, that's a perfect text for that. But as I'm speaking, there's a young man right in front of me, and handsome, tall guy, but I can tell because in our church in Duncan, we worked with a lot of people coming up who had been caught up in the snares of addiction. I can tell that it was probably crystal meth or something that he had been hooked on. And but he is coming unglued. He is just simply melting down as I'm speaking, heaving, cascading with tears. And so afterward, I come and I have a chat with him, and I said, what's up, dude? And he starts crying again, and he says, well, while you were speaking, God confirmed the call he's put on my life. And I says, well, what is that? And he says, I think you're right. Teen Challenge is this ministry to the legions of people nobody wants. But he says that in this town anyhow, there's been such a wonderful hospitality among the churches. They're so embraced about what we are, that everybody wants us to be part of their church and wants to be involved in this ministry. And everybody wants the guy handing out the bulletins who has tats all up his arm and, crawling up his neck. That's just cool to them now. And he actually says, our ministry has become kind of sexy. He says, while you were speaking, God confirmed who he's calling me to reach. Sex offenders. And honestly, I thought, but I didn't mean that. Let's go to the other side. Now, I'm telling this story not because necessarily that's a call of your church, but to come back to my point that I think this is a template, not just it's an historical account that functions as a bit of a paradigm, saying, how far will he go to reach the people nobody wants? Not only will they come running to him, but he'll go running to them. He'll actually cross the storm and call us to join him and have deeper, deeper faith. How far is he willing? Let's go to the other side. Let me give you some quick touchstones before I get you in a conversation of how I see the mission of God functioning. Again, touchstones meaning non-prescriptive, non-exhaustive, but some patterns I'm seeing. Often the mission of God calls us to places that we don't want to go. Anywhere but there, God. We all know how dangerous a prayer that is. It often calls us to go through things no one wants to face. So interesting that this mission to the one that nobody wants around, involves such a fracas, such a disruption just to get there. The storm, it's not easy going. And so it takes us through things we don't want to face. God, if this is your heart, make it easy. He says, no, let's make it hard. Let's make it fun. Let's have a storm. It often makes us afraid. Let me just briefly speak to that. I got saved at 21, a beautiful Baptist church that gave me a great love for the Word of God and a deep understanding of personal salvation. There's maybe some other things that could be supplemented in that mission, but it was very good and a great place to land when I was 21. But one of the things that I remember being taught quite explicitly from many, many quarters was that if it's the will of God, you'll feel peace. And so I use that as a touchstone of, okay, if this is God, then I'm going to feel peace. And it never worked. Now, eventually it does. Eventually you come to this place of a peace that passes understanding. And that he keeps in perfect peace those whose minds are steadfast because they are fixed on him. But I began to notice as I began to wonder if that is a the way I've been taught, or at least the way I've heard it, that automatically you're going to just sort of feel the scent of the dove. The waters will calm as soon as you know, and that's going to be the sign that's God's will. That I began to notice I couldn't vouchsafe, or I couldn't find biblical basis for it. And Jesus yet prayed harder, and his sweat was like drops of blood. Often the will of God comes first as a kind of massive disruption, as I've already said, that upends you and makes you afraid and tests your faith in all kinds of ways. And it's wrestling through that I think we finally come to the place of faith. So it makes us afraid. It tests our faith, such that I think that one of the things we see when we're really called out in mission, and this isn't like, an everyday thing. These are seasons that we go through where we feel Jesus is saying, let's go to the other side, let's do further. That it almost tests our faith to the place that the faith we've had prior to that feels like no faith at all. Do you still have no faith? Some of you know exactly what I'm talking about, that when Jesus calls you into some new phase of life or ministry, that you look back and you think the faith it took me to get to here is almost like no faith at all in comparison with the faith it's going to take now to keep going. It's not that you haven't had faith. In fact, if you hadn't had faith, it wouldn't have got you to here. It's just that faith, that level of faith, isn't going to be enough to go to the other side. It sometimes makes us wonder whether God cares about us. Again, these are touchstones, but I'm almost wanting to make this prescriptive. that if you're on mission with God, there's some point where you think, like, what the heck? Like, what were you thinking? And if this is your idea, why don't you make it easier? Why don't you provide more? Why are the metrics seemingly going in the wrong direction? It is bent, next one, toward the least of these. Again, touchstones. But there's something in the heart of God. And I think the more I understand that, and I'll speak more to that in the following sessions, is that it's not that Jesus cares about people on the margins more than he cares about other people. It's just that he cares, is that often nobody cares about people on the margins. And so there seems to be what the liberation theologists called a preferential treatment for the poor. Just his heart's for the least of these. Next one, it often makes those who see the power of God, God's mission in action, it often makes them fear the power of God more than the power of the devil. In the Legion story, which I didn't spend too much time on, Legion is this guy raging, naked, cutting, bruising, howling, banished. Nobody wants him around. After Jesus casts out the demons into the pigs, they all run over the cliff. And it says that, and he's dressed and in his right mind. And the townspeople come out and they see him. And it actually says, and they're afraid. And they ask Jesus to leave. That I actually believe deeply, and I saw this many, many times in our work in Duncan, that people would rather have the devil contained over there than the Spirit of God loosed all through here. Hence prisons. I think 30% of our First Nations population, or of prison population, are First Nations, which is nowhere, so disproportionately higher than the national population of First Nations. So it's really functions at about 80% in terms of per capita. And I can get really passionate about this. That this is not the solution. But there's something about let's contain it over there, get it out of sight, and then, but I think what the Spirit of the Lord is saying, let's go to the other side and let's figure out a way to so walk in the anointing and the power of the Holy Spirit. That's how Jesus did ministry, Acts 10:38. He went around in the power and the anointing of the Holy Spirit, went all over the place doing good and releasing all those under the subject to the power of the devil. And I think that Lord is raising up the church in the fresh anointing of the Holy Spirit. I honestly believe. I'm a Baptist boy, by the way. I'm a Baptist boy, and I came late to charismatic theology. And the charismatic theology I embrace is not necessarily some manifestation. I don't chase it, and I don't chase it out. The charismatic theology that I've come deeply to believe in is that I can do nothing apart from Him. And that the Spirit is testifying with my spirit that I'm His child. And as I live into that identity, I begin to open myself wide. I stop striving after performance, and I open myself wide with this one cry on my lips: more, God. Give me more. For the sake of the call that you've placed upon my life. And I think the Spirit of the Lord, I speak all over the place. And I'm speaking to virtually every denomination in Canada and some beyond. And every single denomination is asking, how do we get walk in a fuller anointing of the Holy Spirit? Including, I was just asked this last week by a United Church minister to come alongside and mentor her in what she said: we're just longing for the Spirit of God to come and break out all over us. So I'm seeing it in conservative traditions. I'm seeing it in mainstream traditions. I'm seeing, actually, in many ways, the Pentecostal and charismatic church coming to a fresh hunger for the anointing of the Holy Spirit, etc. And I think the Lord is answering our hunger and raising up, and that we're going to see a day, I'm praying, that rather than contain it over there, that the Spirit and the power of God is loosed everywhere. But it's scary for people. We can't do it unless Jesus is in charge. I've already made the point that when Jesus says, let's go to the other side, they took charge of Him. And what they find out is that if Jesus is asleep on your mission, you're really in trouble. I spent years, a season in especially that season where I talked of appeasement. That was the sort of defining trait of my ministry, where I wouldn't even know if Jesus was on the boat, and if he was asleep, because I didn't need Him. And then He got us into some stuff, and I needed to have Him awake. This is what Moses says, and questions are going to come up, and I'll have you discuss those for 10 minutes. Moses, in his argument, actually, with God in Exodus 33, where God's smoking mad at the people for their idolatry, and He's going to kill them all, and Moses talks him out of that. Actually, it's one of those moments that pastors, if they had it, you'd have to ask, what would I decide here? Jesus, or the Lord says to Moses, I'm going to kill all these people, and I'm going to make you great. And He turns them down. Like I can't believe it, really. There's moments I would have gone, hot diggity, let's do that. And next time he has a bad thing like that, this is Numbers 11, he simply goes to God and says, like kill me. I'm done with these people. And the Lord has words for him then. Moses says to God, after God says, I'm not going to kill them, but I'm not going to go with you. I'm pulling out. You can go alone. And this is what he says: if your presence does not go with us, do not send us up from here. How will anyone know that you're pleased with me and with your people unless you go with us? What else will distinguish me and your people from all the people on the face of the earth unless you go with us? And Jesus was anointed with the Holy Spirit and power and went around doing good and rescuing all those under the oppression of the devil. Questions? Take 10 minutes. We'll come back. One of the most important questions that you can ask as a church or a ministry is this: where is Samaria and who are the Samaritans? Now that obviously would be a good question to explore biblically, historically, but in terms of ministry at the moment may not, well, actually would have a lot to say about ministry at the moment. Where is Samaria and who are the Samaritans? Anyone in the days of Jesus could have answered that very quickly. Samaria is over there and the Samaritans are those people. And the code word is those people. Whenever I do a talk about First Nations and somebody comes up to me after and says, I really like those people, I know that we're just starting the journey. In Jesus' day, that question could be answered unhesitatingly, but it's interesting that it's not a question always on the radar of church leaders today. And I would like to convince you otherwise if it's not on your radar. Samaria are those people. Samaritans are those people. It's that place. We share some history, some territory. We bump up against one another. We intermingle on the streets, maybe in the restaurants, in the malls. There is some kind of vaguely shared spiritual root that got kind of messed up on their side. And there's bad blood. High levels of suspicion, animosity. There's a kind of thinking is that no good thing could come from Samaria. When Jesus tells the parable of the Good Samaritan, first of all, how misnamed is that? Luke never describes him as a Good Samaritan. His actions that emerge are very good, in fact, quite divine. But part of how we've actually neutralized that story in our own day is that the term Good Samaritan has become just kind of a proverbial term. You see it in the newspapers even. Somebody does some good deed and they're described as a Good Samaritan. In Jesus' day, that was a contradiction in terms. And the shock of that story that I think we really need to, if you're going to preach it, try to recapture it. Try to find the person that the people listening least want to be the hero of the story and make them the hero. And then you've got some of the shock value of that parable. Whoever you're talking to, the person that the audience least wants to be the hero, make that person the hero. Because that's what Jesus does. In the way he sets it up, Kenneth Bailey just died actually, a tremendous exegete and commentator on especially the Lucan parables and the Palestinian culture that Jesus was speaking and working and living in. But Bailey shows in that story of the Good Samaritan how shocking it would be for Jesus to, as a third person getting introduced in that narrative to help, possibility, the potential to help the man in the ditch, first as a priest, then as a Levite, that there would be kind of an enjoyment in the audience that he'd kind of dissed the religious bigwigs. There's always kind of an enjoyment when we diss somebody in authority, isn't there? And so there'd be a bit of that kind of ha, those, they don't have their act all together. But what they're expecting in that third fold classic storytelling pattern is the person who comes along is going to be just a good, ordinary Jew. And when Jesus says, and a Samaritan came along, that for many of them, they'd have stopped listening at that moment. Those people. And Jesus never met one he didn't like. So many stories touch on this. In fact, if out of this workshop today, or maybe you're already very much engaged in this kind of thinking, but if you feel that your mission and ministry, whether it's parachurch or church, is to identify and somehow ask God, receive a vision from God to reach Samaria and the Samaritans, it wouldn't be bad to just spend some time soaking in those stories of Jesus and the Samaritans. My favorite of them is in John 8, when the religious leaders of the day accused Jesus of being demon-possessed and a Samaritan. His rebuttal is, I'm not demon-possessed. And where are the other 9? It was only the Samaritan felt that they needed to come back and praise God. Never met one he didn't like. And I think the most convicting passage around this for me is the woman at the well, John 4. Again, here we go. A woman, somebody nobody wants, not even her own community. Go over there. Stop hitting on her husbands. Jesus meets her that day. He's exhausted. He's tired. He's hungry. He's thirsty. And begins a conversation with the woman at the well with these words, "Can you give me something to drink?" Nobody's ever wanted anything. No man certainly has ever wanted anything from that woman other than her body in a long time. And she's shocked that this Jewish rabbi should breach so many boundaries of cultural decorum, to not only speak with her, but to ask her for a drink from her water pot, this unclean thing. If mission calls us to lose our religion, Jesus certainly led the way. And that text says, John 4, and Jesus had to go through Samaria. Jesus had to go through Samaria. Never seemed in a rush, Jesus. There's no implication that he's sort of hightailing it up there, up into Galilee. So the implication is that the must of that text, the imperative of that text is not geography or schedule, it's mission. Later, when Jesus sends the Holy Spirit upon his community, and by the way, Acts 2, the falling of the Holy Spirit is not the founding or the formation of the church. The church is already in existence. It's the empowering of the church for mission. So when the Spirit comes, he says this in Acts 1:8, go wait for my Spirit to come upon you, and when the Spirit comes upon you in power, you will be my witnesses in Jerusalem, Judea, and the ends of the earth. No, there's something inserted in between. And Samaria, the very people that would be tempting for, even at this point, for these Jewish believers to avoid, he says that's got to be on the map. And my growing conviction is that when Jesus gives that sort of that widening geography, Jerusalem, so the town the place the neighborhood the culture you completely share, you're utterly at home in. Judea, where it starts to get a little strange, but they still eat the kind of food you eat and dress and talk the language you. Samaria, those people. And to the ends of the earth, that Jesus is articulating not just kind of, basically the geography of missions. He's actually articulating the dynamic of missions, that if you neglect one, you imperil the rest. That these interlock. And we see actually this is the exact pattern of the book of Acts, that it moves out from Jerusalem into Judea, to Samaria, and then to the ends of the earth. And as I said, in each instance, there's a fresh empowering of the Spirit for that mission. And Jesus must go through Samaria. Here's what I want to do in these next few minutes, and I want to leave a little bit of time for Q&A, is I want to talk about 3 potential Samarias. Your Samaria may not fall under one of these 3 categories, but at least it gives you an idea of the kind of Samarias that might be roundabout in our Canadian cities. Street people, the homeless. I've been in your town. I've been downtown in your town. And there's a lot of people that are surviving, just kind of doing what they need to do in the street, and maybe have no fixed address. Dorothy Day, who founded the Catholic Workers Movement back in the dirty 30s, had a radical conversion out of atheism, communism, hedonism to Christianity, and looked around at the deplorable conditions in New York in the 30s during the Depression, and had this extraordinary insight that the gospel was not just to impart eternal life, but actually life and life to the full. And that she saw what this unemployment was doing to the hearts and spirits of people around, that it was actually robbing them not just of a good meal, but dignity. And so she founded the Catholic Workers Movement as a response to this. In her book, The Long Loneliness, Dorothy Day said that when Jesus shows up, he prefers to wear one of his dreadful disguises. Quoting, of course, or citing Matthew 25, I came to you and I was hungry, I was thirsty, I didn't have any clothes, or I was in prison and you came to me. I was wearing a disguise. You ever wonder in that story in Luke's gospel, which would occur roughly, only Matthew does the least of these things, and I came to you naked or hungry or thirsty and you came. But Luke has not quite chronologically placed in the same way, but kind of near the same kind of arc of the story. Jesus' teaching on the least of these is pre-resurrection of the story I'm about to cite is post-resurrection, but it's Jesus on the road to Emmaus. And Jesus comes alongside these guys who are really disheartened because of what's happened with the crucifixion and et cetera. And he begins to teach them from the scriptures, and he's walking alongside, and so the style of teaching, the cadence and tonal qualities of you'd think they'd recognize him, but they don't. And he's wearing some kind of disguise. Somehow they can't see, even though all those clues are being given. It must have been a dreadful disguise he had on. He must have been easy to reject. And then interestingly, the moment their eyes are open, they see Jesus, and when they persuade him, he pretends like he's going on. And they persuade him to come in and join them for the meal. And it's when he takes the bread and breaks it that suddenly their eyes are opened. Just saying. I think that maybe it's almost Luke's version of a testing of the Matthew 25. If I came to you and I didn't look like me, would you still invite me in? Would you still persuade me to come to the table? What I'm going to show you in a moment, I'm not going to get through all the material on this just for the sake of time. But I want to show you some photographs in a minute by the world-renowned photographer Martin Scholler. Martin is, even if you don't know the name, you've almost undoubtedly seen his work. He's shot some of the biggest celebrities in our day, Clooney, etc. He has a remarkable portrait of Barack Obama. But the last year, Martin Scholler has been living in West Hollywood and working at the homeless shelter in West Hollywood. And he's been using his remarkable gift of portrait photography. He doesn't do candid portraiture, sitting portraitures, to photograph people who use the services. Now, before I show you that, I want to set this up with a little description of some of the work being done right now, research work at Berkeley University. And the research in neuroscience at Berkeley has to do with a nerve in our body called the vagus nerve. Not Vegas as in a place you go to lose your money, but vagus as V-A-G-U-S, longest nerve in the body. And it's connected with that part of our brain that is associated or lights up when we have spontaneous, almost they can't help it response of compassion. So the can't help it response of compassion is when the little bird flies into your window and is, twitching on the ground, and everything in you just wants to gather it gently into your cupped fingers, hands, and nurse it. And if it's not immediately recovering, you make a little box for it and you feed it worms, and that your heart goes out to this little creature, and then that glorious moment when hopefully you take it out onto the deck and open your hand and it flutters up into the sky, and you're like, oh, that whole thing's your vagus nerve going woo, woo, woo. You didn't have to sit there and say, well, I feel compassion for this little bird. It just it gushes out of you. Vagus nerve lighting up that part of your brain. Now here's the research doing at Berkeley. They've been researching the responsiveness of the vagus nerve across socioeconomic lines. And what they found, and oh, by the way, the vagus nerve is also associated with spontaneous generosity. Just, I want to give. What they found, and this may or may not surprise you, is that the people with the least developed, least responsive vagus nerve are the affluent. And the people with the highest developed, most responsive vagus nerve are the impoverished. Now, some of you are not surprised by this because you know how the giving goes in your church. That we're having to kind of whip people, browbeat people, coax people, beg people, grovel before people, shame people, whatever, to try to actually be generous. You know, the only churches in North America that have per capita tithing are urban or inner city ethnic churches. It's not probably happening on your watch, right? The average giving, per capita giving in a North American suburban church is about 2.5% to 3%. You see, what will we see? And we saw this in the church I was pastoring in Vancouver Island. The more that our doors were wide open to people who showed up sometimes in dreadful disguises, the more we watched these spontaneous acts of kindness and generosity. So here's something we saw quite often. We would give somebody some clothing because they desperately needed it. And then 2 weeks later, we noticed they didn't have the clothes on. And then we saw somebody else who desperately needed it wearing those clothes. Because it's just this vagus nerve. It's just like tingling, alive. Now, I'm going to show you the Martin Scholler photos. These 2 months ago with Ron Weber, who's back on the controls, I just randomly picked this from a huge gallery of photos from Martin Scholler. And what I want you to do is look at the faces and especially the eyes of these 6 portraits, and then I'm going to ask you one question. I wanted to close with Raquel because you've seen her before, or you know her, you've met her. Quite famous. She's a woman at the well. You see it, right? The Samaritan woman at the well, right there, Raquel. Question is this: can these people teach you anything? I believe that Jesus asked us to develop eyesight, to actually cultivate the vagus nerve toward the least of these, not because simply we have to kind of help them, but because even more profoundly they need to help us. My friend Julius Karanja, the bishop of the African churches and schools in Kenya, the poor people need the rich people to save them, and the rich people need the poor people to save them. Okay, second group that may qualify or be part of your Samaria is new immigrants. Now, Ron, can you put the map of the distribution of new immigrant populations? So that the dark red are the highest proportion of concentration of new immigrants, which in your town I think are mostly Chinese and then Filipino. Interesting, you have in all of Canada the highest, and of course you're the capital, so this would make sense, but the highest proportion of new immigrants from the U.S. But these graphs are in your booklet, but this is the distribution of new immigrants. Now, this is quite interesting to me. I know it's not a big town, Ottawa, but in some of the other cities we've been in, it would be very, very hard to drive through them without going through a high-density new immigrant population. It's pretty easy to go around here, according to this map. In Calgary, the city I'm from, it's probably the most marginalized of all the communities in terms of geographic distribution. And I know that this isn't necessarily coming from the top down. This is communities deciding I'm going to live there. And some of that has economic reasons. It's cheaper. Some of it, there's a faith community, et cetera, resources, restaurants. But the northeast sector of Calgary is this huge area of red, and there's hardly any other dark places or darkly colored places in Calgary. Which means in Calgary, it's very easy to avoid new immigrants. Super easy. Those of my friends who, some have moved intentionally as church plants into those areas, but many of my friends found themselves in churches in a part of the city that the demographic has radically changed in the last 15 years or so. And some of you may find that. And in conversations with those people, the conversations tend to go two ways. One is it's really cool, and we're asking for God for fresh resource and vision about how we respond to the very, very rapidly shifting demographic. The other is they're annoyed. They're competing with parking with the mosque now, and they're annoyed. And they feel that there's been an incursion and their community's been taken from them. Now, I don't live in one of those communities, so it's cheap for me to make any comments about that. But what I would like you to at least consider is that right now, Canada, and we'll just talk about Canada, this is happening in many, many Western countries, but Canada is in a moment of prophetic fulfillment. The way prophecy works is that there's often multiple fulfillments. There's the sort of immediate context that would make sense to the people who are first hearing or reading that prophecy. There's the eschatological, the denouement, the culmination of all things fulfillment often. And then there's all the stuff in between. And I want to suggest that we're in a significant moment of a horizon of fulfillment for some biblical prophecy, particularly Isaiah 2, and I'll leave that to you to read, but Isaiah 2, and the Isaianic prophecies are full of this, but Isaiah 2 is where it kicks off, that there's a day coming where God is going to bring the nations to us. Now, that's a Zionistic prophecy, but I think, again, at multiple levels or horizons of fulfillment. I think we're in an Isaiah 2 moment where the nations are coming, and they're coming, according to Isaiah 2, curious about our God. Particularly, they're curious about that we worship a God who beats plowshares, or rather swords into plowshares. In other words, a God of peace. Isn't that interesting? Hello, Syria. And there's one exhortation in Isaiah chapter 2, verse 5, to the people of God, "O come now, Jacob, walk in the light of the Lord. As the nations come, get your act together." Now, the other, I think, prophetic fulfillment in our day is Zechariah 8. There's many, but I'm just picking out two that strike me as particularly salient. Zechariah 8 is the promise of God coming to dwell in Zion or Jerusalem. But again, a possible horizon fulfillment is God coming to dwell visibly, tangibly in Ottawa and surrounding areas. And it talks about how that's going to be marked out in the faith community. Young and old, new levels of actually delighting in spiritual formation and spiritual practices, treating your neighbor with respect, etc., etc. Zechariah 8, verse 23, famously closes. You'll recognize this quote. "In those days, 10 men from every tribe and tongue and nation will grab the hem of the robe of one Jew and say, 'Can we come with you?' Because we hear God shows up when you meet. We hear God is with you." I think if you put those two passages together, that God is in right now an intensified season of bringing nations to us that are curious about our God. God is asking us to walk in the light. God is asking us to be visible, tangible representations, manifestations of His presence among us. And that He says you don't even have to really get all hot and bothered about evangelistic strategies. You just have to live in this reality of who I am and who you are. And people will start to grab hold of you and say, "Can we come to your church? Because we hear God shows up." Coming back to my point about some of the church leaders I know in Calgary who found the demographic of their community shift, I've urged them to read and steep in those texts and say, is it actually a sign of God's great favor on you that you should find yourself right in the thick of this? Not way over in little Cochrane, white bread Cochrane that I live in. I know there's a Cochrane, Ontario. I mean, this thing is as white. I don't, it's any lovely, but it's as white bread as a town can get. But what an amazing thing that you should be in the thick of all the nations coming. And all you have to do is just actually open wide to the presence of God that wants to fall upon you. And watch what God does here. And I'm seeing that I talked to one guy on one of these tours who exactly in that situation, and he's having the time of his life and also getting some of the best food he's ever experienced. 2004, going back 12 years, I had my very first trip to New York City. It was a Tuesday that I landed at LaGuardia, got a cab down to my hotel right on Times Square, which is wonderful in one way, and you have to have very thick curtains to get a good night's sleep if you have a hotel right on Times Square. And with a friend on a cold night in April, we immediately kind of freshened up and then went down on the subway to Brooklyn, because my friend was the friend of a man by the name of Jim Cymbala, who is a pastor at Brooklyn Tabernacle, and some of you may have read his books, especially Fresh Wind, Fresh Fire, about the remarkable revolution of prayer that happened there. And so it was Tuesday night. It was a prayer meeting at Brooklyn Tabernacle. And I was quite frankly nervous because I had been so inspired by the description of this prayer meeting in the book Fresh Wind, Fresh Fire. I was preparing myself to be disappointed. I needed not to, because there's no way that even the most gifted writer in the world could describe what goes on that church on a Tuesday night. We got there about 20 minutes before it started. They had just officially renovated an old performance hall that sat 3,500 people, and they were already turning people away on a cold night on Tuesday in April for a prayer meeting. Because my friend is a friend, we had reserved seats near the front, so we did get in. And for the next 2 hours, they stormed heaven. It was extraordinary. I grew up pagan. I'd gone to, I'd name a concert from the big band for the 70s. I was there. My Bic. Yeah. And, but I never, ever experienced the kind of levels of energy that I did that night at Jim Cymbala's church in Brooklyn Tabernacle. Afterward, because my friend was a friend, we went out to the Sicilian restaurant owned by the Godfather, I'm quite sure. Little guy with big Coke bottle glasses, holding I think a violin case, but I'm not sure. And anyhow, had unbelievable pasta. And in the middle of the dinner, Jim Cymbala turns to me. It's just Jim and his wife and my friend and me. And he says, "Mark, do you know what the #1 sin of church leaders in America is?" And I'm kind of going through a little Rolodex of possible options about the worst possible sin, partly just calling up my own stuff. And but it's a rhetorical question. He's going to answer it himself. And he says, the greatest sin of church leaders in America is that the church leaders are not on their knees crying out, "Oh God, give us the broken, give us the drug addicted, give us the prostitutes, give us the transgendered." He actually said that in 2004. "Give us all the people, all the ethnic groups, all the people that nobody else wants. Bring them to us, and then give us your love and your power to actually see transformation." And I thought, man, it must be tough being an American pastor. No, I was broken. And God used that single encounter to begin to unravel something actually around the spirit and this ministry of appeasement that I described at the beginning of the day. And realizing I was committing the worst sin of church leaders, I was not on my knees asking God. Because it's only when people that you don't have the resources within yourself to actually make the appeal to be reconciled to God, that you need God to make that appeal, that you get really desperate for God and the Spirit of God. And that's why I became charismatic, even though I'm Baptist. And I went home and I shared that with my wife, and we were both very broken by it. And finally I got up the nerve and I went to the elders and I said, we have 1/8 of our community is First Nation, and we're doing nothing. We don't want them. We're not asking. We have no vision. We have no passion. Those people. I said, I can't be your pastor anymore unless we do something. I don't have any clue what. And if that's not a place you think you want to go, then let me know, and I honestly, without demur, will leave. But if it's something that you think this is from God, then let's go and let's rock. And they said, let's go. And what happened over the next 10 and some years was the most extraordinary experience of my pastoral ministry. Was it messy? Yes. Was it costly? Yes. Was it hard? Yes. Did we know what we're doing? No. Did we see the power of God, the kingdom of God come in power like nothing else before? Just over a year ago, the Truth and Reconciliation Commission in Canada that was appointed in 2007 to investigate and gather the stories of the residential schools here in Canada finished its work and began issuing the first of what will be 7 final reports. Part of those final reports are 94 calls to action You can get this in a PDF form as soon as we're done. If you want, you can call it up if you don't know them. Just TRC, calls to action, 94 of them. Amazingly, only 4 are for the church. These were church-led schools. And only 4 of the requests coming from the First Nations community about, would you do this? Would you consider thus? Not stuff we asked, stuff they've asked, First Nations people are asking. Only 4, and actually if you look at them, only 2 of them actually are directly at the church. The others are theological institutions like Ambrose, where I teach. The fatal flaw in the TRC, it was based on the South African model under Mandela and led by Desmond Tutu. It was based on that model with one fatal omission. And I won't go into all the background why this didn't happen. There's mostly a legal reason for it. In the TRC in South Africa, perpetrators, or people who actually had furthered the apartheid system, had an opportunity to receive amnesty if they testified. And so many thousands of testimonies came from people who had actually killed and tortured and raped and all of these things. Canada, our TRC, had no equivalent mechanism, and so there are virtually no testimonies coming from people who actually ran or worked in residential schools. A few came forward of their own accord, but they were the good guys. So, here's what I know for sure, because I talked to many of my First Nations friends. If the church right now doesn't respond to the 2 out of the 4, because again, 2 are directed at the theological schools. If we do not take seriously the calls to action that have been put before us, in great humility actually, the situation will become worse than it's ever been. Guaranteed. Because the only real feeling that the First Nations have that they are being cared about and listened to is our response to those 94 calls to action. Perpetrators didn't come forward and give testimony. That was a deep validation of the stories in South Africa. 6,000 plus stories from First Nations people as we moved across Canada, and only a couple, like I say, from people actually were involved in running residential schools, and none of the bad guys came forward. And so there's a sense that this thing is so incomplete, and we get to finish it. What I'm asking is, would you familiarize yourself with all 94 calls, but particularly the 4 and particularly the 2 directed right at the church, or if you're in a theological institution, look at the 2 directed to you. Numbers 58 through 61, in case you needed to know. And Numbers 59 and 60 particularly have to do with the church. Would you simply have a look at those, prayerfully ask, personally and within the leadership group, God, how are we going to respond to this? And I think that the cumulative weight of thousands of churches across Canada doing something, even if it's a small thing, will make an enormous difference. And the cumulative weight of us doing nothing will be tragic. Let's go to the other side. Dawn.